Kia ora, you're listening to Crossing Currents, Aotearoa New Zealand Artists in Venice, a podcast series by Contemporary Hum produced with the support of Creative New Zealand. In this series, we'll be interviewing the Aotearoa artists presenting at the 60th Venice Biennale and its parallel events. I'm Elena Kafka, Managing Director of Contemporary Hum, and today I speak with architect, artist and writer Elisapeta Hinemoa Heta about her presentation, The Body of Wainuiātea, which is featured alongside work by artist Latai Taumoepeau in Re-Storing Oceania, an exhibition curated by Taloi Havini at Ocean Space in Venice. Located in the Church of San Lorenzo and led by TBA 21 Academy, Ocean Space is a centre for exhibitions, research and public programs intended to catalyse critical ocean literacy, collaborative research and environmental advocacy through the arts. Elisapeta Hinemoa Heta is of Ngātiwai, Ngāpuhi, Waikato Tainui, Sāmoan and Tokelauan descent. She is a multidisciplinary artist, designer and mother, living and working in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Elisapeta is principal and leader of Wakamaya, an initiative founded in 2015 that guides the architecture firm Jasmax towards becoming an authentically bicultural design practice. She has contributed significantly to cultural design outcomes at Jasmax and is an advocate for change, speaking internationally to provide Māori and Pasifika perspectives on the importance of place to design and cultural identity. In 2022, Elisapeta received the prestigious Te Kāhui Whaihanga New Zealand Institute of Architects President's Award. She also exhibited work in Nerin, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney, together with the artist John Miller. I spoke with Elisapeta from her home in Tāmaki Makaurau. Maybe to start, it would be great to just talk a little bit about the sort of background of how you even came to present in Restoring Oceania.
Actually, it was Ane Tonga that brought us together, myself and Taloi. She had obviously created the declaration show that was at Auckland Art Gallery, and then the symposium that followed. And she asked me to come in and speak as a part of the symposium for the day, and Taloi was one of the artists from the exhibition. And I sort of got up and did my thing, as I usually do, because I do a fair bit of public speaking. Taloi spoke about her practice and I was just like gobsmacked, immediate fangirl, what a phenomenal person. And then we were sort of sitting in the green room, just having a beautiful conversation, before and after. We both spoke actually, but afterwards she was just like, whoa, like I love your practice and what you're into and interested in, and this is great. Just in the way that Taloi does, you can sort of see her weaving ideas in her head. And we just kept in touch, basically. And last year I happened to be heading over to Brisbane, funnily enough, to give another talk. And she was like, actually, sis, I've been thinking of you. I'd really like to chat to you while you're here. Can I take you out for coffee? And effectively, she just sort of said, look, this is Ocean Space. I had this opportunity to be there, funnily enough, for the Architecture Biennale in 2021. In the thick of COVID, she couldn't physically get there, but she was an artist. And she said, and this opportunity's come up again for me to curate a show. I've already, I've been in conversation with Latai, and I'm going, holy shit, Latai is just this amazing person as well. These two women are like, wow, people, just big deals, still are. And she was just like, I'd really love for you to be involved in this, and then so she sort of started talking to me about her ideas, the sort of foundation of what Ocean Space was, what they were trying to achieve, this relationship back to the ocean, the fact that they kind of historically probably hadn't paid much attention to Te Moana Nui a Kiwa specifically. And I think when they tapped the vein of Taloi in, 2020, 2021, they were like, oh, we want to keep going with this, brought her on, and then she brought us on, and it sort of steamrolled. So it's kind of, it came about in the way all good things do, just relationships and really lovely conversations, usually over coffee. But it came about at a really opportune time too, because of a lot of projects I've been working on and some thinking I had been doing anyway. So I've been working on the Whale Malai project, which is a pan-Pacific whale, which isn't an architecture that exists. But the brief is to create a pan-Pacific whale in Wellington. And so we won that job a few years ago, and I've been working with Albert Rafiti, who I obviously name as one of my collaborators in the work. And Albert and I have been having these long conversations about what architecture across the Pacific Ocean looks like, and I've been involved in a few conferences and things. And so there's sort of an amalgamation of a whole lot of conversations actually just came together at this perfect moment. And Taloi said, "Hey sis, do you want to be involved?" And I was like, actually, yes, I'd love to be, but I'm also pregnant. So it was this really funny moment when we caught up of going, when exactly? And oh, wow, okay, so this is all going to happen in parallel, but actually there's something perfect about that. And we just kept rolling with it. So we knew it was all going to happen kind of literally side by side. But it turned out to kind of weave into the fabric of the way the work came together anyway. So that was fine. It's perfect.
Totally. I mean, you do get the sense when you're in the space that there's this kind of perfect or just really sympathetic confluence or dialogue between obviously the two works, which is very much to do with Taloi's curatorial work and curatorial thinking about that relationship. But they sit so well side by side, and they're both such rich works in their own right, and then so rich when you kind of experience them together. But your work is called the Body of Wainuiātea. Could you start by just describing the structure of the work?
The Body of Wainuiātea sits in the back room, well, the kind of second room in San Lorenzo, which was an old church, deconsecrated church. It's a really beautiful and kind of wild space. I've been and visited it, and we were told that there's somewhere between a 7 to 12 second delay echo through the space. And that was partly designed that way because of the nuns that used to sing in that particular space. The centre, the room itself is bisected by an altar, which I believe is the largest in Venice. So it's a very interesting space architecturally, which I kind of gravitated towards. The first thing that hit me that I started to think about when I visited the space last year was the fact that when a lot of missionaries came to the islands and to Aotearoa, a lot of churches were actually built on top of marae or malai spaces, which were already our communal spaces. And part of what Taloi wanted me to create was a space for conversation and for storytelling. And I thought there was something kind of interesting about that relationship of taking the marae or the malai or the atia back and putting it inside of a church. Not to subvert the church in any way, but to sort of just to recontextualize it instead of erasing it like a lot of churches did. They took the communal aspect of it and built on it, but obviously not in a great way. So that's sort of where that conversation started, with the notion of the atia or the marae, the malai, that cleared space for ceremony, for exchange. So I sort of started the design thinking about how you might create that clearing inside of a church. Usually those things reference the compass points or, the natural environment. So there's often a cosmological relationship. Because the space was physically inside, I decided to keep it quite simple. The entry is on the eastern side of the atia, facing west towards the altar. So it means as a person entering onto the atia, you're looking directly at the altar. Kind of, if you're standing at that entry, to your right up the page, so to speak, is north. and to your left is south. So it kind of quite simply orientated itself in the room, and the chairs that are low to the ground are also set up on the compass point. So there's 16 chairs, north, south, east, west, and then 2 in between each of those compass points. So usually when we set ourselves up in an oratory way, say in Samoa, the orators would organize themselves relative to their villages or, their chiefly titles around the room in that way. And I wanted a simple way of people being able to kind of figure out how they might organize themselves in the space relative to just the cardinal compass points, really. And that's the sort of the layout of the ground, which has been risen up again with the use of 17 tons of brick, which has come locally been imported in. So I contacted a lovely friend who's a brick supplier in Sydney, who connected us with one of their suppliers from Italy, and they sponsored us. So we were able to bring the brick in, and it will go back as well. So, there's a big concern with waste through the Biennale, and we didn't want to be holding on to too much. So those bricks come in, they're locally sourced, they're from that earth, they're from that place, and they will go back to the supplier afterwards. The texture and the colour was meant to sort of fit with the general, I would say, ahua, but, feeling vibration of that room as well. So that was its intention. Everything is sort of meant to be kept quite raw material-wise, so it is performing its function as its material. It's not trying to disguise anything else. Similarly, the chairs are single, sort of solid pieces of wood that have had a scoop kind of carved out of them to give the function of seating, and then they've been charred or burnt black just to kind of elevate their purpose, I suppose, in the space, just to be those beautiful kind of solid things that stand out from everything else. It's quite muted in tone. Draped above the aotea is 12 folds of a really beautiful light gauze type fabric, which it can depend on different villages, different islands, but some cosmologies will talk about the 12 levels of heaven. Certain atua or deities had to climb the levels of heaven to search for the baskets of knowledge is one sort of story in New Zealand. There's all different versions of that through the Pacific, but there are always these consistent conversations about levels of heaven. So what I thought was really beautiful is to have this kind of folding softness, this billowing above the aotea, because it's actually a really hard space as well. You've got marble, stone, concrete. I've brought in brick, there's timber, there's lots of hard things. So I wanted something really soft to kind of disperse the light as well. It relates back to the wider story of Wainuiātea and her relationship to Ranginui, the Sky Father. But it could also be seen as a relationship to just sitting underneath the waves and looking at the kind of that Hinemoana, she churns up the surf and things like that. So there's a few ways of reading into that.
Wainuiātea is an atua.
Yes. I'll explain a little bit more about Wainuiātea soon, just because she is an interesting story that I didn't even know about until I started this project.
Oh, right.
Those are the kind of physical aspects. You may or may not know, but when we tended to travel between the islands, we would often take objects with us and give them or gift them. And you'll still find in places like Hawaii on Heiau, they will have, now I'm going to use the word altar, but it's not the altar it's not the word they would use, but there are often offerings of things, near their heiau, effectively. There's already an altar in the space. So I wanted to bring an offering of sorts to the room, and I always wanted it to be something that invoked another sense. So there's 2 things on the altar, or 3 things technically: hue, or gourds, which we obviously travelled with through the Pacific. They were water containers, they were seed containers, but they were musical instruments, and hui themselves also have a relationship to another atua. They have a performative and a ceremonial purpose. So the gourds are there that were made by Hiramari Moiwaka. The other sort of element that's there is 40 coconut bowls that have a combination of coconut oil and halala fragrance in them. So again, the purpose of that is, I mean, if you've been to the islands, we cover ourselves in coconut oil. We use coconut oil in our hair and our cooking. It's a pungent thing. It's very kind of ubiquitous with the islands. Again, for me, being pregnant, when I went for my site visit, Venice is an overpowering smelling place. And there's something about memory and story that are interconnected, and that's what Taloi and I talked about a lot, was just this relationship to story and telling stories and invoking stories that have been lost. And there's a direct correlation between smell and fragrance and memory. So I wanted smell to be in the room, and it didn't have to be overpowering to be present. And so that is the coconut oil and the halala that sits on that altar as that offering to that scent of the ocean, of the Pacific Ocean. And then the kind of last element in the room, which isn't physical, is the soundscape. So there's two parts to that. One is a Taumoepeau track, or Māori musical instruments, which is also played by the same woman who made the hui. So Hiramari recorded that using several different Taumoepeau that actually all relate to childbirth and equally relate to Wainuiātea. And that just is meant to interplay a little bit with Latai's work on the other, in the other room, but it's meant to give a kind of another, I suppose, layer of feeling, of memory to that particular space. And it doesn't play constantly. It pops up and down through the day. And the other soundscape bookends every day. So you have a karanga, or a call done by Māori woman, that starts the day. It opens the space, and it also ends the day. And the purpose of that karanga is to acknowledge Wainuiātea, to acknowledge the people that are coming into the space through the day, to clear the room for them, to set the intention for the exhibition. And then at the end of the day, it does the same thing by kind of closing the space. So because there were no Māori or Tangata Pasifika people that could hold that space every single day, and therefore culturally safely bring people in and out of the room, the best way I could think to do that was through karanga, to allow karanga to be the thing that would safely allow people to bring their stories in. That karanga can also serve as a sort of ceremonial bookend to events that Ocean Space may or may not run through the year, right? So if they're running a lot of talks and different things in there, and they can run the karanga to begin an event and to end the event. And similarly, that's to provide cultural safety. But I also gave them a translation of what's being said, so that if they wanted to pass that on to people who were coming and going, they got a sense of that. But that is all the part.
I mean, it's really a sort of transformed space, kind of on every sort of level. I mean, architecturally, sonically, sensorially.
I wanted it to attempt to invoke as many of the senses as possible. I struggle with the look but don't touch aspect of art exhibitions sometimes. There's a purpose to it, I understand that, but I suppose for me, I enjoy the tactility of things, and that people can sit on the things that have been created, touch, smell, kind of engage with it, because I feel like it taps into the other parts of your emotions that I want the art works to tap into. The only things that really aren't there is kind of taste. But to be honest, for most people, the coconut oil will go straight to a sense of taste anyway, because most of us have a sort of understanding of what that might taste like. So yeah, I mean, it's deliberately meant to tap into all the senses, and that I would include the sense of spirituality as well. Like, it's meant to have a reverence, which churches tend to anyway, whether you're spiritual or not. And it's giving another layer to that. I will say that I do really want to acknowledge again just the huge work that Taloi did to bring us together, to weave our conversations and the works physically and spiritually in the space. She really held everything and still does. You know, she's quite the po for that work. But for me, you know, I've named a few collaborators in Albert Rafiti, and that's really through just lots of deep conversation about this big, wide discussion that I'm still discovering about our ceremonial spaces across the Pacific. And him and I will be working on that probably for the rest of our lives, I think. You know, Heta and her, the deep conversations we've had and the creations and things that she's made for the space and for the work was really critical, particularly when it came to the story of Wainuiātea physically. And Rhonda Tibble, who recorded the karanga for us and composed that karanga, she kind of acted as almost a cultural advisor, you could say. It's a bit of a cheesy term, but I actually mean that in a beautiful kind of, as a Māori wahine with an incredible amount of experience. You know, she really, again, grounded that work for me. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge those people who helped us bring it all together. And my daughter, who was born, you know, a few weeks before this work opened, because actually a lot of the things that were physically designed came about while I was pregnant with her. And I would dream about them at nighttime. So physically, the actual design of the thing largely came about while I was dreaming. And I have a feeling some of that influence might have been from her. So I feel like the two kind of were born or birthed at the same time. And that's kind of important. So I just wanted to acknowledge those things.
It's a collaborative work on so many levels. And you were going to say a little more about Wainuiātea?
Yeah. So what we would call pūrākau, or the story, the narrative of Wainuiātea, was something that I was told about during a haputanga wānanga, like a pregnancy wānanga, education thing. So while I was creating the work and, you know, we were thinking about the ideas and I was workshopping quite a lot with Taloi, one of the big things that kept coming up for me was wanting to come back to this reconnected relationship that we used to have as people of the ocean. So most people are really aware of the writings of Epeli Hauofa and our Sea of Islands, and this notion that actually it's very much the colonial view that we are separate small islands. The smallness is a new concept, but that actually we existed before in this way of thinking about ourselves as being part of the ocean. So maybe the continent of the ocean is a better way of thinking about it. Or I like to think about the body of water that we all come from. Growing up in Aotearoa, there's always been very much this kind of Māori and Pacific peoples, and somehow we've separated ourselves out from that thinking of being a part of the ocean. And there's a desire to go back to that relationship or that whakapapa to the Pacific. When I went to this haputanga wānanga, Hira Marie was running it, and she told us the story of Wainuiātea that she had also learnt from another woman. The story effectively is that one version of the creation of the gods is actually not about, it started with Wainuiātea and Ranginui not Papatuanuku and Ranginui. So in this version, Wainuiātea is the whole ocean, the whole of Te Moananui, what we now know as Te Moananui-a-Kiwa. And her and Ranginui were in a relationship. Actually, his name was not Ranginui. He had another name. It changed when he became the husband of Papatuanuku. But Rangi and Wainuiātea create the female gods. So their relationship brings about all the goddesses of water, fresh water and salt water. Their first daughter is Hinemoana, which is the top layer of the ocean, and on it goes. Effectively, Wainuiātea realizes that they keep creating ira wahine, this female energy, and it's throwing the universe out of balance. So she decides to make the kind of ultimate sacrifice of her love to Rangi, and asks her first daughter, Hinemoana, to split her waters, to part her ocean, and to allow Papatuanuku to rise up through her, so that basically Papatuanuku and Rangi can come together as a partnership, as we know that they do, and then they create the male gods. So, there's lots of different versions of how the gods came together. There's very much a colonial view that appeared once we had settlers come to Aotearoa that effectively only talks about Papatuanuku and Ranginui creating men. There are other views or other stories that will talk about them creating men and women, but I'd never heard the story of Wainuiātea before, and this relationship to the whole ocean and her being this huge body of water. I thought it was amazing, and it's a birthing story as well. And each of the female gods that they create, of which I can't even get into because there's a whole list of them, they all have these roles. And what I thought was really interesting as well, coming from the nerdy architecture side of things, was that the word Aotea was in her name. Now, we also often tend to contextualize tikanga or protocol and customs with having very specific male roles. But the idea that Wainuiātea has Aotea in her name, for me, was like a clue that actually there's a balance with the wahine and tāne side of things that we've lost. And I became really interested in the role, I always have been, but in the role that women play that's really critical to the way all of our ceremonies come about effectively. Now, we know that karanga is the first voice that is typically heard on the aotea in Aotearoa, but it made me think about the fact that, for example, in Aotearoa, people always talk about the aotea as being the domain of Tūmatoinga, the god of war. But actually, I've heard stories about, yes, Tūmatoinga is definitely a part of the aotea, but that manuhiria first brought on by Hinemoana as the wave that washes and brings them in to a certain point on the aotea, and then she washes back. And that links to an older story or an older relationship to our marae being the space between the beach and the outer coral atoll, and that your boats that come in and out are being brought in and out on the waves of the ocean. So it's this long connection that we have as Māori to our many Hawaii, the many different parts of the ocean. And Wainuiātea and her story was the first time I'd felt like there was an atua that connected us all in a really succinct and quite beautiful way, because a lot of it is very Aotearoa-centric, right? So that was what blew my mind, effectively.
Yeah, something that really sort of struck me, being in ocean space in the context of the Venice Biennale, which was happening outside, is that the Biennale is this totally nation-focused event, like very strictly organized by nation states. Whereas you go into ocean space and you get that sense of the oceanic, like the sort of oceanic connection and that fluidity, between cultures, between land masses, which, like you say, like Epeli Hauofa, like Sea of Islands, it's not cleanly demarcated, boundaried nation states that is the sort of production of colonialism. So that was I don't know, I feel like being in Venice, that was such a kind of breath of fresh air.
I had hoped, and we had hoped through our conversations, and it sounds like from your experience of it thus far that it's part of what would bring a kind of symbiosis between what I was creating and what Latai was creating. So, you know, Latai's mahi is really thinking about the kind of deep urgency required to think about this huge problem that is deep sea mining, right? And it's scary, and it can make you filled with anger and rage and fear and all of those things that are quite real. But, you know, she addresses it in the way Latai does, just with like this kind of beautiful clarity of thinking, and then through performance, and then through your engagement with it. And all of that is just kind of stacked in layers that you don't even realize they're going to punch you in the face quite the way they do, but they do. What I had tried to create in the Body of Wainuiātea was a sort of, they're not meant to sit in opposition or kind of as binaries of one another, but to sort of say, okay, so we have these emerging issues that are popping up that we know about with climate change, with the sea level rising, with things like deep sea mining. I believe that things like retelling our stories and retelling our connections to one another that bring about a sense of bigness again, and actually this the idea that we might come from a single body again might actually draw us away from this kind of need to keep pulling in the colonial powers to give us money and to solve our problems and to, you know, help our smallness, our perceived smallness. And that's where some of these issues are coming from, but also that we can kind of pack a punch when it comes to these big critical conversations about things like sea level rise. And, you know, we're not, we shouldn't be just kind of going along with whatever consequences the world is going to throw at us, because we're actually a third of the world. You know, when you look at the whole of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, it is a third of the mass of the literal whole earth. And so I think that's what we were just really hoping to pull on, was like, there are these emerging conversations to have, and maybe these are ways to start thinking about ourselves again. And also to reposition ourselves in the minds of places like Europe, because it is an unusual conversation to have in Venice, right? It's, you're sort of like extracting parts of your culture and like prettifying it for this really epic thing that is the Venice Biennale. So it is a strange thing, but actually the context of that is important, because they also need to understand the position that we are coming from, that's been thrust upon us, that we have now ingested, that we need to change. So it's all of that. And Wainuiātea was the first time I'd been able to grapple with that as an idea, really.
Because when we were talking with Latai Taumoepeau and Taloi Havini, and Latai's work is called Deep Communion Sung in Minor Archipelago, This Is Not a Drill. Amazing title. Yeah. I mean, it's all in there.
Yeah.
And it's
what's the work about? Read the title.
Yeah, exactly. And you got it. It's this really just amazing, clever, participatory installation with these rowing machines in this sort of auditorium scene. And when the rowing machines are activated, they play the sound of the me etupaki, the sort of ancient Tongan choral ritual. And of course, when we were in Venice, we saw Latai organize a performance with some amateur local, I think, rugby and basketball players, which was,
I was going to say, or a soccer team.
Yeah.
There's a few different sports teams that came through.
I mean, like you say, there's a total urgency. Like the performance is very moving, because you really kind of feel that collective effort and that collective like appeal, you know, for change and for attention to the moana. But of course, Latai is also very much interested in creating that kind of ceremonial ground, like the marae or the mala'i as well. And so those are kind of parallels between your works. When you were sort of in discussion with Taloi and putting together your work, were you and Latai, what was the extent of your communication and your works coming into being? Was there a lot of kind of dialogue or bouncing off, or did they sort of take shape in their own ways?
There was a little bit. They took shape in their own ways. Obviously, Latai is a full-time artist, she's living and breathing her practice daily. And it's not that I'm not, but obviously I'm practicing in the architecture space every day. And so my world is slightly different, but her mahi did come about sort of through deep conversation with Taloi much before I had kind of come into it. And I think it was because it was a part of a lot of, and if you know Latai's work, it's sort of coming about as a part of a lot of the other mahi she was already doing and is doing. But effectively, so they had an idea of what her work might be. And she was, thinking about the production of it. And then Taloi brought me on. And effectively, we would have these, honestly, these hilarious conversations on WhatsApp, video calling. And Taloi would be somewhere in the world because she was never in one spot at any given time. Latai seemed to always be on public transport. Literally, she was always on the train or the bus. And I was at work. It was this kind of humorous but beautiful, actually really tactile thing where we would just kind of get in and we would talk about our lives and we would talk about these things we were thinking about and, the production meetings we were trying to have with the gallery. And so our works grew apart, but together, that we kept knocking back into one another, and I'd be like, oh, Latai's thinking about this, and that's amazing because I'm sort of thinking about this other thing over here, and it makes sense in relation to her work. So an example of that, when I went to Venice, I happened to be going there anyway. Before Taloi had even approached me, I had booked a trip and I was off. I was going to New York, Copenhagen, and Venice and Paris. So I happened to kind of be in the space, and when I got there, I was really struck by the altar as being this really huge thing in the middle of this space. It didn't operate quite the way a church, normally does. It's usually that thing that you sort of approach. It's at the sort of back of the room, right? It's all these things, and those are deliberate architectural devices. The fact that it was in the middle of the room to me was like, oh, this is really, I have to organize whatever I'm doing to face it. There was something about the room required, the altar required, it couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be a wall in the room. It had to be a part of the thinking, right? And I had told Taloi and Latai that. Anyway, they went on their site trip later in the year, I think September. I was there in July. And Latai came back to our group chat and she was like, oh my God, sis, I absolutely get what you mean. And they'd designed the space to be facing actually in the opposite direction. Her whole work was faced around the other way. And we realized that the altar was sort of like this portal between the two conversations we were trying to have. And that maybe Ocean Space had previously, I don't know if they were doing it deliberately or not, but it's almost like they wanted to shy away from the church aspect of the room, and it hadn't necessarily been folded into works before. Some it had, but more as a kind of podiums to display things. And Latai and I were like, no, that both of our works are deeply spiritual in really different ways. The altar actually has to physically form a part of it. So, that's kind of what I mean. Like the way our production came together, we sort of riffed off each other's thinking quite a lot. And Taloi, as you know, is just this phenomenal mind who could kind of like stitch and weave between the two of us and the communication with the gallery and the people helping us produce the mahi in such a way that it actually all felt like it was coming together at the same time. It felt like we were all sitting next to each other constantly. So yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing to feel like we did it in isolation, because we really didn't, even though they were quite uniquely sort of different things as well. I actually think that is the brilliance of Taloi, I have to say. As a curator, her mind really shows in in the way our works have come together.
So the gallery, is that TBA 21 that you're working with?
Yeah, that they've got quite a lot of different things going on that are all a part of this kaupapa, is how I would describe it, which is all to do with this kind of relationship to the ocean, education, health, artistic exploration, etc., that all relate to the ocean, and that sort of sits under TBA 21 as far as I understand.
Because something we're sort of interested in is passing out the resources it takes to get to Venice, present your work. Where did you have to kind of gather these resources from? Was it sort of supported by TBA 21 and their kind of subsidiary sort of arms, or was sort of New Zealand involved as well? How did that work?
I personally, and we didn't receive any funding from Aotearoa, but anybody, any organisation, which is fine because largely the funding has come from TBA 21. I did badly, mind you, and kind of late in the piece, I did approach a couple of people at CNZ to ask if there was a conversation I could have about getting myself and potentially a couple of other people over there to do a pūrākau, a closing of sorts, in October. I mean, I've always sort of sat slightly outside of the art world in a funny way. I tend to come in and do projects often that I'm asked to do. I have ideas and I do research and I do other things and writing and all sorts of things, but pretty much every art project I've ever engaged in has been me being approached to produce work, which is cool. It usually means that there's funding already sitting there. So me applying for funding has always been a bit of a funny old thing. And it was actually part of the reason, I have to admit though, why Taloi asked me to be involved. So two things. She thought it was kind of funny that she was asked as an artist to be involved in the Architecture Biennale, and thought it would be kind of a nice reciprocity to ask somebody in the architecture world to be involved in the Art Biennale, which I loved. But she was also mindful of the fact that this was, going into ocean space, and she wanted to present something that felt like it was coming from women from the ocean. So to bring someone from Aotearoa over, herself, the Thai, we've all got really different whakapapa, really different upbringings and perspectives to come at this. And my architectural bent to it was part of that. So she sort of curated us to come together, but it also means the funding looks kind of funny, right? Like we're all sort of coming from really different places.
It's always interesting thinking about, especially in the context of arts funding in New Zealand, the sorts of go-arounds, people need to figure out to make work and get them places. I would love to ask you about, seeing as we've been talking about Oceania and oceanic artists and coming together, to ask you about your thoughts on this year's Biennale being, kind of just a huge success for artists from Oceania, with Mataaho winning the Golden Lion for the international exhibition and Archie Moore winning the Golden Lion for the national pavilions. Yeah, what do you feel about that? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, isn't it high time that Indigenous artists were finally paid their dues, is one way of thinking about it. They're producing the best work anyway, is my very biased opinion. I'm good friends with some of the wahine from Mataaho and am a huge fan of their work. Always have been. Wrote a chapter about them in my master's thesis that I hope nobody reads. Archie's work, which I've only seen through photographs, made me cry because I could feel there's a feeling about so much of the Indigenous work that I've seen through the imagery that's being created that just is really mind-blowing. It's touching on a nerve, it's touching on a political nerve, it's touching on an environmental one, a spiritual one, that all of those things are so critical. It's the world I live in anyway, which sounds obvious to say, but I mean in that everything I do, regardless of whether it's performing, singing, writing, making, whatever I'm making, it's always about coming back to this Indigenous storytelling thing, whether it's my own stories, trying to find stories, trying to create space for others. The fact that these amazing artists are doing exactly that and are getting the recognition for it that they really should is, it's high time, and it's exciting. There's been some phenomenal artists that we know, Indigenous artists have been going to the Biennale year in, year out, that we all know are great. So, the cynic in me wants to say, is it a trend that people are kind of waking up a little bit to how fucking awesome we all are? Maybe. That's okay. I'm happy with them, making those realizations, because I think there's a lot more there to be said. And there's a huge amount that we all have to actually contribute to that discussion that I think will be exciting to see. But I actually think the Indigenous mahi that's been created that I've seen grounds it as well. I think it grounds what could otherwise be just like full-on Disneyland. Like, from what I've seen and what I've experienced myself, I feel like we're having really important conversations, but we're making it beautiful and accessible, which isn't a word I'd usually use in this context, but I mean it, and it kind of hits everybody. Yeah, it makes me feel like I have a place in a thing like the Venice Biennale because of the works of people like Mataho. All of those things are contributing to a global conversation about Indigenous voice actually being really impactful at the moment, and critically impactful about critically important things. And you kind of can't deny that, if our arts are thriving, that we've kind of got somewhere to go from. You're not sitting in total survival mode. If you're just in survival mode, you actually can't create beautiful art, right? So for me, that's a really important thing, that we are able to make beautiful, impactful, important artwork. It says something about, our future. I think that's really important and exciting.
You've been listening to Crossing Currents, Aotearoa New Zealand Artists in Venice, an original podcast series by Contemporary Hum. Listen to Crossing Currents wherever you get your podcasts, or visit contemporaryhum.com for each episode, along with a transcript and images. Our thanks to Creative New Zealand for their support, Hamish Peterson for editing and mixing, Matariki Williams for cultural advisory, and Emma Kanyuk for design. Kia ora.